Okay, so we continue along our journey through concise theology. And I think the reason why Packer has kind of packaged the book this way is that it's just 1, 2, 3 pages. It makes it quite easy for us to digest rather than the type of classes we did before, which was almost like a systematic theology. Today, the topic is God's sovereignty. At least the first topic is God's sovereignty. And the principle of this idea of God's sovereignty is that God reigns. God reigns as the king. So one of the verses that the Bible clearly shows this is where Nebuchadnezzar, who at that time thought that he was the king of the universe and Lord of over everything that he was ruling. But at the end of it, he said, at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven and my understanding returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, that's El Elyon, which is our God. And I praised and honored him who lives forever. Why? Because his dominion is an everlasting dominion and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. So Nebuchadnezzar realized that there was a God above him who reigned forever and ever, everlasting dominion, unlike human dominions which come and go, human kings who come and go. So there's a huge difference in perspective here. The Bible continues to tell us throughout the scriptures that God has absolute sovereignty over creation, providence, and the grace that he provides to us. And because of this, it's the biblical basis for our belief and for our praise. The vision of God on the throne is a recurring theme in the Bible and a recurring theme in many of our hymns and the songs that we sing about the King who reigns over all things. It also is quite explicit that the reigning King, God, exercises dominion over everything, even the great things or the tiny things. Even the littlest thing, mundane things, even things we may think is not spiritual. He exercises dominion over all of these things. At the same time, the Bible talks about God's rational creatures, that is, human beings, as well as angelic beings, having some form of free agency. That means the power to make personal decisions as to what they will do. And yet, although we have this free agency, God as sovereign, we still are answerable to God as the judge. So it's kind of a conundrum, right? If there is almost as if there's no free will, if we have to answer to God. Is it then possible, this question that we always have to ponder, is it then possible to distinguish, as Scripture does, between the bad purposes of human agents and the good purposes of God? We talk about the problem of evil, and one of the issues in the problem of evil is that we assign evil to the bad purposes of human agents and not to the good purposes of God, although God is still sovereign over all of this. And so we have to ask ourselves, if that is the case, then we have to accept, as some of these verses say at the bottom here, God can sovereignly overrule human action as a planned means to achieve his goals. That would be his decretive will. His decretive will allows him to organize the way things happen entirely according to his will and independent of human will. So there's this kind of paradox here that comes into play. And this is one of the reasons there may be often so much debate between, God's sovereignty, God's free will, and how do you find a balance here? The fact of free agency confronts us with a mystery. Inasmuch as God's control over our free, self-determined activities is as complete as it is everything else in the world. This is what we call his decretive will. That means whatever he purposes to do will happen, which is why the prophecies of the Old Testament happened in the New Testament. They would happen despite human beings making whatever choice they would along the way. But it's a mystery, right? Because his control over our free, self-determined activities is complete. So how this can both be true, we do not know. We do know that God exercises his sovereignty by letting things take its course. This is called his permissive will. So there are certain things he allows us to do, because it's called his permissive will. He allows us to do it to achieve his decretive will, which is what he wants overall to happen. And he often allows all these things to happen to his end rather than miraculous interventions in our life. So he doesn't have to do interventions to create a certain reality that he wants at the end of life or at the end of the world. He allows our permissive will to somehow work within his overall decretive will. So decretive will basically means God will make sure that what he wants will happen. Permissive will is where he allows us to do things within his decretive will. So a paradox obviously is a seeming contradiction. And the Bible uses paradoxes. In fact, the Bible teaches a lot of its principles through paradox rather than just linear logic, right? Bible uses paradox at times to explore the full scope and nuance of truth as compared to linear logic. For example, one of the probably the biggest paradox that we always confront is the teaching that God is a triune God, right? He is one, and yet he is three persons. We cannot explain this paradox. We believe it by faith. And when we try to explain it, most of our explanations are not very clear. We'll never satisfy anyone who asks for logical understanding of what it means that God is one God in three persons. And so the other perplexing paradox, among many others, is the interplay between God's sovereignty and human responsibility. So I think that's where it falls in, right? Almost like, just like we have difficulty explaining God's triune nature. Well, not difficulty, we can't explain it. It's a paradox, it's a mystery. Same thing happens with God's sovereignty and human responsibility. We're still responsible for our actions. He will still judge us, but he is the sovereign God who ordains all things that happen in the world. So Richard Hanson in Preaching Today, he uses this concept. He said paradox reframes the issue, any issue, right? Ever notice Jesus preaching does not have the point by point fill in the blanks. Directness so popular today. You go to some churches, they have this point by point. Okay, this you fill in the blank, and then they'll have it on the screen, and then you dutifully fill in the blank. Whereas Jesus was often intentionally paradoxical. He wanted people to think. So these are what is called open-ended sermons, open-ended questions, which sent listeners away scratching their heads to some extent, because there were some loose ends for them to tie together. This is why a good Bible teaching sends people home, for them to wrestle with this and ask God's Holy Spirit to help them to tie it together for their own life. We can't make specific rules for everybody. It just wouldn't work. And so Richard asks this question, how long would most modern preachers last if our key leaders regularly asked as Jesus' disciples asked Jesus, tell us what you're trying to say this morning? When Jesus gave a parable, the disciples were scratching their head just like everybody else. And then they had to go and ask him for the explanation. And Jesus gave the explanation. And he also said that, those who will be able to understand this are those who know me, who are spiritual. Those who are not spiritual, those who are hard of heart will not understand the paradox. So I think that's where we have to leave it, because we really will not be able to explain it in a logical manner. But in the Bible, there are many, many parts of the Bible which talk about God's sovereign rule, how we can grab principles, right, from it. So one of the Psalms, for example, Psalm 93, Packer is quoting to give 3 principles to just think about how God's sovereign rule impacts our life. Number 1, it guarantees the stability of the world against all the forces of chaos. If we know that God is sovereign, then we know that despite all the chaos that we see around us, the wars, the difficulties, the suffering, the illness, whether it was the pandemic, whether it's the war in Ukraine, whatever, we still believe that God is sovereign. Therefore, there is going to be stability. There's some stability. That's why, the voices of things like climate change, all these, the doomsday voices. For Christians, we have a more settled perspective because for us, God is still in charge. Secondly, from Psalm 93, verses 5a, it says that it confirms that God's sovereignty will confirm to us the trustworthy of all his promises. Whatever he says, whatever his directives are, when he says this is going to happen at the end of the age, this is what we can trust that that's going to happen. And that gives us great sense of peace in our heart. And lastly, of course, when we understand that God is sovereign, ruling over the world, we will worship him. That means our whole being will want to worship this sovereign God, and we are called to a homage of holiness. We express wholehearted joy, hope, and confidence in God. And this is particularly helpful when each and every one of us at various times of our life faces trials and tribulations. We realize that God is in charge. We can look at these 3 principles and we can think about it and we can say, yes, God is still in charge, and therefore I can rest in the shadow of his wings, like Psalm 91, another good psalm for talking about how we can rest under God's sovereignty. So the question to ponder, again, you see, we don't give answers, we ask, the Bible asks us to ponder. In times of difficulty, do we feel defeated? I mean, it's okay to feel stressed out initially. It's okay to feel a little anxious. But do we become defeated? Do we descend into a morass of depression? Do we end up so anxious that we end up with psychosomatic illnesses? Or do we see God in his magnificence, in his sovereignty, and to express that nothing will happen beyond his will? We always quote Romans 8:28. Many people just throw that verse around. But basically, it's talking about God's sovereignty, that he will work together for the good of those who love God. The place where we often misunderstand is for good. We always think that in times of difficulty, for good means that either the difficulty will be removed or that we will be given prosperity and health and so on and so forth. But in context, if you read the whole of Romans, that section of Romans, until Romans 11, before I go on to the practical aspects, you'll see that Paul is pointing to heaven, that finally all things will work together for good at the end of the day. So I think this is the question we need to ponder. If we're struggling today, if we're struggling with some issues, we're struggling with something that's happening and we are feeling down, defeated, we got to ask ourselves this question: how do we see God in his magnificence? How do we see God in his sovereignty? And that is the principle that we want to learn from today, which is God is sovereign and that he reigns as King of Kings and Lord of Lords.